Disclaimer. July 20th, 1944, 3 p.m. The Mount Washington Hotel, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 44 nations gathered. They created a new financial god, the U.S. dollar, backed by gold, the official reserve currency of the world, a system of absolute monetary power, a trap disguised as a privilege. August 15th, 1971, 9 p.m. President Richard Nixon addressed the nation. He severed the dollar's last tie to gold. The Nixon shock. The world's reserve currency became pure faith, pure debt, a fiat weapon. Global dominance unlocked. The final stage of the trap was set. March 18th, 2022, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The U.S. Treasury Department froze the central bank of Russia's assets. $300 billion vanished from the global ledger. The ultimate financial weapon. A declaration. The rules of money are not rules. They are tools of war. The world watched and began to count its own exposure. Thesis statement. This is not a story of economic cycles. This is the story of the reserve currency trap. A predictable, lethal pattern of imperial suicide. A 5-stage sequence where the greatest economic advantage becomes a fatal poison. It has collapsed every monetary superpower in history. Without exception, the weaponization of monetary privilege is not the cause of the collapse. It is the symptom, the final, desperate confession that the real economy has failed. That confidence has eroded. That force must replace trust. We will trace this pattern through 5 empires. And we will reveal where the United States dollar and the American-led financial order stands within this historical countdown today. The pattern/framework introduction. Historical analysis reveals a consistent 5-stage collapse sequence for reserve currency empires. The lifespan of this dominance is not random. It is a predictable decay curve. Stage 1. The Hegemon's bargain. A new superpower emerges from crisis. It offers a stable, trusted global currency. In return, it demands deep structural integration. It exports its rules, its debt, and its financial system. The world accepts. The trap is set. Stage 2. The debt addiction. The privilege of printing the world's money creates an illusion. Deficits don't matter. Trade imbalances are sustainable. The empire begins to consume more than it produces. It finances this gap with its own currency. Debt compounds. The industrial base erodes. The financial sector metastasizes. Stage 3. The weaponization turn. Internal decay creates external insecurity. Facing economic challengers it cannot outcompete, the empire reaches for its unique tool, its control over the global payment system. It uses sanctions, asset freezes, and currency exclusion as tools of foreign policy. It mistakes financial violence for strength. Stage 4. The accelerating erosion. Trust shatters. The world's central banks and trading partners begin a silent, relentless diversification. Alternatives are sought, tested, and institutionalized. Transactions slowly decouple from the imperial currency. The feedback loop of debt and devaluation intensifies. Stage 5. The currency crisis and systemic reset. A terminal loss of confidence triggers a run. A sovereign debt crisis becomes a global liquidity crisis. The empire's bond market, the bedrock of the old system, fails. A new monetary order emerges from the chaos, always led by the next productive, creditor economy. From imperial Spain to Great Britain, the pattern is an autopsy report, and the U.S. dollar is at stage 3, the weaponization turn, the point of no return. Hashtag Phase 2, historical context. The story begins not with the dollar, but with the vacuum it filled. 1944, Europe was rubble. Asia was smoldering. The British pound, the previous global reserve, was bankrupt. Britain owed the equivalent of 130% of its GDP, mostly to the United States. The world needed a new anchor, a new god of value. The United States presented itself not as an empire, but as a benevolent architect. By 1944, it held 75% of the world's official gold reserves. Its industrial capacity was untouched by war, producing over 50% of the world's manufactured goods. It offered the Bretton Woods system, a dollar convertible to gold at $35 an ounce. All other currencies pegged to the dollar. Stability through American credibility. The world signed the bargain. By 1960, the dollar comprised over 60% of all identified central bank foreign exchange reserves. The eurodollar market, dollars held outside the U.S., exploded from near zero in 1950 to over $40 billion by 1960. The U.S. financial system became the world's central nervous system. Wall Street became the global capital allocation machine. This was the zenith of the Hegemon's bargain. The U.S. exported dollars via the Marshall Plan, military spending, and investment. The world used them for trade, held them as reserves, and parked them in U.S. Treasury bonds. It seemed like a perfect, self-reinforcing loop, a system of American abundance and global growth. By 1970, the U.S. Treasury bond market was the deepest, most liquid risk-free asset pool in history. The dollar was invincible, the fatal decision/turning point. But the trap was already springing shut. Stage 2, debt addiction, was underway. To fund the Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, and persistent trade deficits, the U.S. flooded the world with dollars. By 1971, U.S. gold reserves had plummeted from 20,000 metric tons in 1950 to just over 8,000. Foreign governments, led by France, began demanding gold for their surplus dollars. The system was breaking. August 15, 1971. The fatal decision. Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar became a pure fiat currency. The official narrative was one of necessity and strength. A bold move to protect American interests. The truth was a confession. The U.S. could no longer honor the foundational promise of its monetary system. It chose to preserve its domestic political economy, its ability to run unlimited deficits, over the system's global credibility. This was the critical, irreversible pivot. The dollar's value was now untethered from any external discipline, backed only by the full faith and credit of a government entering a permanent deficit era. In that moment, the weaponization of the dollar became inevitable. If the currency's value was no longer anchored to a physical commodity, its power rested solely on two pillars: the threat of U.S. military force and control over the global financial plumbing, the SWIFT messaging system, the correspondent banking network, and the dollar clearing system. The first pillar was expensive and messy. The second was clean, silent, and total. They had created the ultimate soft power weapon, and they would eventually use it. Nobody saw the full consequence in 1971. They saw a technical monetary adjustment. They missed the systemic shift. The United States had abandoned the discipline of the gold standard but kept the exorbitant privilege of the reserve currency. It was like removing the governor from a steam engine while continuing to stoke the fire. The engine would run faster, hotter, until it exploded. The countdown to Stage 3 had begun. Hashtag Phase 3, the pattern breakdown. Stage 1, the Hegemon's bargain ***. A new superpower rises from the ashes of crisis. It offers stability, security, and a reliable store of value. The world, exhausted by chaos, accepts. The empire exports its currency, its rules, and its debt. The trap is baited. Historical example 1. Spanish Empire, circa 1550 to 1600. The discovery of Potosi in 1545 flooded Europe with silver. The Spanish Real de Ocho became the world's first truly global currency. By 1600, it was used from Manila to Madrid to Massachusetts. Spain offered the world a stable, high-purity silver coin. The bargain? All colonial trade must flow through Seville. All bullion was crown property. The empire's centralized financial control, building a global system where its unit of account was non-negotiable. The Habsburg monarchy financed its endless European wars with this silver stream, believing it infinite. Historical example 2. British Empire, 1815 to 1914. After defeating Napoleon, Britain established the classical gold standard. The pound sterling, pegged to gold, became the anchor of global trade. The bargain? The City of London became the world's banker. By 1870, nearly 60% of world trade was invoiced in sterling. Britain ran massive capital account surpluses, lending pounds to the world to build railroads and buy British goods. It created a network of colonies and economic dependencies that were financially tethered to London. The system was backed by the Royal Navy. The world trusted gold. It got London's ledger. Historical example 3. United States, 1944 to 1971. Bretton Woods. The formal, institutionalized bargain. The U.S. offered gold-convertible dollar stability. The world got the IMF and World Bank, U.S.-designed institutions. By 1958, the dollar made up over 70% of global reserves. The U.S. ran persistent trade deficits, pumping dollars into Europe and Asia to fuel recovery and create markets. The world recycled those dollars into U.S. Treasury bonds, financing American consumption and military expansion. The cycle was locked in. The dollar was the sun. Every other currency orbited it. Stage 2. The debt addiction ***. The privilege erodes discipline. The empire discovers it can live beyond its means. It finances deficits with its own currency. The real economy hollows out. The financial sector becomes a casino. The foundation cracks. Historical example 1. Spain, 1590 to 1640. The river of silver created an illusion of limitless wealth. Spanish monarchs, from Charles V to Philip IV, borrowed against future bullion shipments to fund continental wars. Debt-to-revenue ratios exceeded 60% by the 1590s. Domestic industry was crushed by inflation, the price revolution. Why manufacture textiles in Segovia when you could buy them cheaper with silver in Flanders? Spain became a consumer, not a producer. By 1620, declared bankruptcies, defaults, had occurred in 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647. The silver was spent before it arrived. Historical example 2. Britain, 1914 to 1944. World War I shattered the discipline. Britain abandoned the gold standard to print money for the war effort. National debt soared from 25% of GDP in 1914 to over 140% by 1920. The interwar years saw a failed attempt to return to gold at the pre-war parity, crushing British exports. The industrial lead was lost to the US and Germany. By 1945, Britain was the world's largest debtor nation. Its net external assets had turned negative for the first time in centuries. Sterling was propped up by capital controls and imperial preference, not economic strength. Historical example 3. United States, 1971 present. The Nixon shock removed the last constraint. Total U.S. public debt held by the public, $370 billion in 1970. Today, over $27 trillion. The U.S. trade balance turned permanently negative in 1975. The manufacturing share of GDP collapsed from over 24% in 1970 to about 11% today. The finance, insurance, and real estate, FIRE, sector share of GDP surpassed manufacturing by the early 1990s. The current account deficit, the measure of how much more the nation consumes than it produces, has averaged 2 to 3% of GDP for decades, peaking at nearly 6% in 2006. The addiction is quantified. The world funds American overconsumption by accumulating dollar-denominated IOUs. Stage 3. The weaponization turn ***. Internal decay breeds external insecurity. Facing economic challengers it cannot outcompete, the empire reaches for its unique, asymmetrical weapon, control over the global monetary network. It confuses this financial violence for enduring strength. It is a sign of profound weakness. Historical example 1. Spain, the embargo of Dutch rebels, 1580s. As the Dutch revolt challenged Habsburg power, Spain weaponized the real. King Philip II issued decrees forbidding trade with the rebellious provinces. He seized Dutch ships and assets in Iberian ports. The result? The Dutch created their own financial innovations. The Amsterdam Wisselbank, 1609. A public bank that offered secure, stable deposits, and the birth of modern stock markets. Spanish financial warfare catalyzed the rise of its more commercially sophisticated rival system. Historical example 2. Britain, the Sterling area and blockades, 1914 to 1945. During both World Wars, Britain used its control over the global sterling settlement system as a weapon. It imposed draconian capital controls within the sterling area, forcing colonies and allies to hold their reserves in London and sell gold and dollars to the British Treasury. It used naval blockades as a financial tool. The unintended consequence? It accelerated the desire for autonomy. Post-1945, colonies and Commonwealth nations began to diversify. The 1956 Suez Crisis, where the U.S. threatened to dump British bonds, proved that weaponized financial dependency was a two-way street. Historical example 3. United States, the sanctions era, 2001 present. Post-9/11, financial weaponization became routine U.S. policy. The number of U.S. sanctions designations exploded from 912 in 2000 to over 9,000 by 2021. The pivotal moment, excluding Iranian and later Russian banks from the SWIFT messaging system. The 2022 freeze of Russia's central bank reserves crossed the Rubicon. For the first time, the core assets of a major economy, held in what were considered neutral, safe custody accounts, were confiscated not due to criminal activity, but as an act of war. The message was received in every capital: dollar reserves are not your property. They are a political instrument of the United States. The weaponization turn is complete. Hashtag Phase 3. Stage 4. The accelerating erosion ***. Trust shatters quietly, then all at once. The weaponized currency is no longer a neutral tool of trade, but a political liability. Global players begin a relentless, structural diversification. They build alternative systems. They trade around the empire. The erosion feeds on itself, accelerating the very decline the weaponization was meant to prevent. Historical example 1. Spain, 1640 to 1700. Following decades of confiscations and trade embargoes, European merchants lost faith in Spanish financial integrity. The silver real began to be discounted in international trade. Dutch banks and English goldsmiths created bills of exchange and notes that bypassed Spanish coinage altogether. The 1648 Peace of Westphalia cemented the political and financial fragmentation of Europe away from Habsburg dominance. By 1680, newly minted Spanish silver dollars were often immediately shipped to Asia, where they still held trust, draining monetary metal from Spain itself. The empire's lifeblood was flowing out to prop up other systems. Historical example 2. Britain, 1945 to 1976. Post-World War II, the sterling area cracked. The 1947 convertibility crisis forced Britain to suspend dollar convertibility for sterling holders after just 6 weeks. The 1956 Suez humiliation proved Britain's financial subordination to the U.S. The 1960s saw repeated sterling devaluations, 1949, 1967. By 1970, the pound's share of global reserves had fallen below 10%. The eurodollar market, dollars held outside the U.S. and British control, exploded, creating a dollar pool beyond London's grasp. In 1976, Britain was forced to take a $3.9 billion IMF loan, the largest in history at the time, imposing harsh austerity. The former global banker was now a patient. Historical example 3. United States, 2022 present. The freeze of Russia's reserves triggered an immediate, measurable shift. Global central bank dollar reserve share has fallen from over 70% in 2000 to under 58% by end 2023, the lowest in decades. Gold buying by central banks hit a 55-year high in 2022 and remained at record levels in 2023. Bilateral trade deals in local currencies proliferate: China-Brazil, India-EU, ASEAN agreements. Alternative financial messaging systems, China's CIPS, Russia's SPFS, grow, albeit from small bases. U.S. Treasury securities, once considered the risk-free asset, are now being actively discounted by foreign official holders. The erosion is no longer theoretical. It is quantifiable in quarterly IMF COFR data and central bank vault inventories. Stage 5. The currency crisis and systemic reset ***. The final stage is a run. A loss of confidence becomes a stampede. The empire's debt market, the bedrock of the global system, freezes. A sovereign debt crisis metastasizes into a worldwide liquidity panic. From the chaos, a new monetary order emerges, always centered on the next major creditor economy with a deep, productive base. Historical example 1. Spain, multiple sovereign defaults, and the rise of the Dutch guilder. Spain's cycle culminated not in one event, but in a series of debilitating sovereign defaults: 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, 1647, 1652, 1662. Each default destroyed trust, raised borrowing costs, and further crippled the state. The financial innovation and stability offered by the Dutch Republic, with the Amsterdam Wisselbank and the guilder, provided the alternative. By the late 17th century, the guilder was the most trusted and widely used trade currency in Europe. The reset was complete, from Habsburg silver to Dutch credit. Historical example 2. Britain, the 1976 IMF bailout and the rise of the dollar. Britain's final crisis was the 1976 sterling crisis. Investors fled pound-denominated assets. UK inflation hit 25%. The government was forced to seek the IMF bailout. The loan came with conditions: deep public spending cuts and monetary tightening. It was the formal surrender of sterling's global role. The Bretton Woods system had already collapsed, but 1976 cemented the dollar's sole supremacy. The reset was institutionalized through the 1970s, the petrodollar system, the liberalization of global capital flows, and the full emergence of the U.S. Treasury market as the global anchor. Historical example 3. The Soviet ruble, 1990 to 1991, a controlled demise. While not a global reserve, the USSR's use of the transferable ruble within the Comecon bloc demonstrates the terminal stage within a smaller system. Weaponization through political control of the currency was absolute. When underlying economic reality, chronic shortages, lack of productivity, became untenable, trust evaporated overnight. Member states bartered directly. The currency became worthless paper. The system collapsed and was replaced by hard currency, dollars, Deutschmarks, trade. It is a microcosm of the final, violent stage of a weaponized monetary regime. The pattern is complete: Hegemon's bargain, debt addiction, weaponization turn, accelerating erosion, currency crisis and reset. 5 acts. A historical tragedy playing on a century-long loop. Chapter 8. The United States of America. The dollar system. It is not at stage 1. It is not approaching stage 3. It is in the accelerating phase of stage 3, the weaponization turn, with one foot firmly in stage 4, the accelerating erosion. The period from 2022 onward marks the historical inflection point. The data is no longer a warning. It is a chronicle of a collapse in progress. Current evidence: the weaponization dashboard. Financial sanctions scale. Between 2000 and 2021, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, sanctions list grew by over 933%. As of 2024, over 30% of the world's nations are under some form of U.S. financial sanction. Reserve asset seizure precedent. The 2022 freeze of approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank assets established the new rule. It demonstrated that safety and liquidity, the twin pillars of a reserve asset, are now subordinate to U.S. foreign policy. A political decision can turn a risk-free asset into a worthless entry on a frozen ledger. Central bank gold acquisition. Net purchases by global central banks shattered records. 2022, 1,081 tons. 2023, 1,037 tons. This is not investment. This is monetary defense. It is the direct, physical diversification away from financial system exposure. De-dollarization metrics. The dollar's share in global SWIFT payments has fallen from over 45% in 2015 to under 47% in early 2024. More tellingly, the share of U.S. Treasury securities held by foreign official entities, central banks, governments, has plummeted from a peak of 34% in 2015 to approximately 23% in 2023. They are not just diversifying currencies. They are reducing exposure to the core debt instrument of the empire. The catalyst. February 24, 2022. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a geopolitical earthquake, but the true financial tectonic shift came days later. March 2022. The decision by the US and G7 to immobilize the central bank of the Russian Federation's assets. This was not a sanction on individuals or war-making entities. This was a direct assault on the foundational concept of sovereign reserve immunity. Every finance minister, every central bank governor on earth understood the new equation. Your reserves are not yours if you cross Washington. The revelation was instantaneous. The exorbitant privilege had officially become the exorbitant weapon. And in that moment, the incentive structure for the entire world flipped. The priority was no longer yield or liquidity. The new imperative was insulation. The race to build and join alternative financial channels, long a theoretical discussion, became a strategic necessity. Stage 4 indicators. The erosion accelerates. We are now witnessing the early, structural manifestations of Stage 4. They are not headlines. They are quietly reported data points and bilateral agreements. Indicator 1. Bilateral local currency trade pacts. China-Brazil, 2023. India-UAE, 2023. China-Russia, over 80% of trade in local currency as of 2023. These are not swaps for crisis. They are permanent operational frameworks designed to bypass dollar invoicing. Indicator 2. Expansion of non-SWIFT systems. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, has seen transaction value grow by over 30% year-on-year since 2022. While still a fraction of SWIFT's volume, its growth curve is exponential, and it is increasingly integrated with China's digital yuan infrastructure. Indicator 3. U.S. Treasury market liquidity erosion. The primary dealer ability to absorb large-scale sales has deteriorated. The 10-year Treasury notes bid-ask spread, a measure of liquidity, has shown increased volatility during periods of stress. When the world's safe asset becomes less liquid, the entire global risk pricing model fractures. Indicator 4. Petrodollar fissures. The 2023 inclusion of the UAE, Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Ethiopia into the BRICS bloc is symbolic of a seismic shift. Saudi Arabia now openly accepts non-dollar currencies for oil, including the Chinese yuan. The bedrock 1974 petrodollar pact is cracking. Indicator 5. Dedicated diversification funds. Major sovereign wealth funds, e.g., in the Gulf, Singapore, are creating dedicated non-Western or Global South investment corridors, explicitly reducing weightings to dollar-denominated assets and focusing on direct infrastructure and equity stakes in alternative regions. The pattern is no longer linear. It is exponential. Each act of weaponization accelerates the erosion. Each move toward erosion justifies further weaponization in the eyes of the empire, which misinterprets defiance as a reason to double down, not as a symptom of its own declining leverage. The trap is springing shut. The United States is using its monetary weaponry with unprecedented frequency precisely because its underlying economic dominance, Stage 2's productive superiority, has already eroded. It is treating the symptoms of Stage 4 with the tactics of Stage 3, a fatal diagnostic error. Consequences and timeline. For over 7 decades, the global financial system has been a single-engine plane. The US dollar was that engine. We are now entering a phase of controlled, then uncontrolled, descent. The landing will be rough. The geography of wealth and power will be redrawn. For the winners, commodity and manufacturing sovereigns, nations with deep reserves of critical energy, metals, and food, combined with industrial capacity, will gain immense leverage. Think Saudi Arabia, energy, Chile, lithium, copper, Australia, multiple commodities, and nations with intact manufacturing ecosystems like parts of Southeast Asia. They will trade in baskets of currencies or their own, regaining monetary sovereignty. Financial hubs in neutral territories, places that can offer legal security, neutrality, and sophisticated banking outside the direct political reach of contending blocs will thrive. The UAE, Singapore, and potentially Switzerland, if it maintains neutrality, will see massive capital inflows seeking a safe, apolitical harbor. Gold and strategic asset holders, central banks, and individuals who accumulated physical gold and strategic commodities before the crisis will see their purchasing power preserved. Gold is the escape hatch from the fiat system. It becomes the ultimate collateral in a distrustful world. The next creditor, the nation or bloc that emerges as the world's primary creditor with a deep, liquid bond market will inherit the mantle. This is not yet determined. It requires trust, rule of law, and openness, factors currently in short supply globally. It could be a reformed EU, a consortium, or a yet unformed system. For the losers, dollar-denominated debtors, nations and corporations with massive liabilities in US dollars will face a crushing double blow. Rising real debt burdens as the dollar potentially strengthens briefly in a crisis, the dollar smile effect, followed by a collapse in access to dollar funding. Emerging markets without strong trade surpluses will be devastated. The American middle class, the principal export of the late-stage dollar empire, has been inflation. The endgame will see a dramatic decrease in the dollar's purchasing power internationally, translating into permanently higher costs for imported goods, energy, and manufactured products. The standard of living built on cheap imports and debt-fueled consumption will contract violently. Legacy financial institutions, global banks whose entire business models are built on dollar clearing, eurodollar lending, and trading U.S. Treasury derivatives will face existential risk. Their asset books will be filled with instruments whose liquidity vanishes during the reset. They are the dinosaurs awaiting the asteroid impact of a treasury market freeze. Nations aligned solely with the fading hegemon. Countries that failed to diversify diplomatically and economically, betting everything on the old order, will find themselves isolated, without access to new financial networks, and holding depreciating assets.